Okay, so this is going to be a little bit shorter presentation talking about pattern of school finance system. We're going to talk about what we do in Oklahoma here, but I want you to get a general idea that there is uh, there's questions as to the best finance system for education, and there is not a single approach that is used nationwide. We'll see that there are some that are used more than others. The bulk of what we'll look at deals with weighted categories, which of course you've been working on the weighted categories, and so Oklahoma definitely uses the weighted categories. So let's talk first about uh, school finance patterns. So just to run down through this list, and you have this chart in your book as well. As you can see, the finance systems vary from state to state. 38 states have some form of foundation school programs. We have part of that foundation program in the Oklahoma formula. As you know, you've been working, you're going to work on looking at foundation aid that is given. 3 states use what's called the district power equalization system, and we will look at that on the next couple of slides. There's some issues with that system. One state has full state funding. It's a little bit misleading because that state is Hawaii, which operates as one single school district. So there is only one school district in the state of Hawaii. One state uses a flat grant, and that's just giving money straight to the schools based on the number of, and that state is North Carolina. And then 7 states have a combination approach. And if you look on your in your book, you'll see that Oklahoma is one of these states that has this combination approach. So when we consider the combination approach and the foundation school program together, then almost all the states, 45 states, use some type of these foundation programs. Okay. And when we're talking about state funds, and we'll look more in the next chapter about what monies we're talking about when we're dealing with schools, what types of monies. When we're talking about state funds, though, how does your state generate revenue? It's generally from sales tax and income tax. And so in a state such as Oklahoma, where as far as state tax goes, we're pretty low taxed in the country. That may be one of the issues leading to some of the problems we see in our state budget. Now, there are other issues that go well beyond that, and we may get into those later on, but certainly while we are one of the lowest tax states in the country, I heard a report, read a report from the Oklahoma Policy Institute that talked about that it's because we have limited ourselves in that way, receiving state tax. Part of it was due by passing the law that said the legislature could not raise taxes, that it had to be a vote of the people to raise any state tax. And believe it or not, since that law was passed, no state taxes have been raised. And then the other thing, the interesting alternative or other perspective, not alternative, was that we have the ability to pay more in taxes. We're just content not to. And so until that contentedness goes down, it may not change. So anyway, we may get into that in the next chapter or two. So the first formula then is, or the first type of state school funding is called what is called full state funding. And so how it works is straightforward. The state collects and distributes all education funding. There are no local revenues. Now, obviously, we don't do this in Oklahoma because as you're working in the next couple of weeks, you're going to be looking at all the local revenues that are generated by a district in Oklahoma. And so part of the equalization formula that we use is uh, districts have to report all the local revenues they can generate on their own, and then that's subtracted from the foundation formula that the state is going to give them. And so, for the most part, that's an attempt trying to equal, to make the formula more equitable. And we'll get into that maybe later on too, because what we see is you hear of some districts, quote unquote, going off the formula, meaning that they actually generate more in local revenue than they would receive from the state, and so they don't get any money from the state for foundation aid or salary incentive aid. And we'll talk about those districts a little bit as we go through. There aren't too terribly many, considering we have over 500 dependent and independent school districts. But there are a few that go off the formula, and we'll look at why they go off the formula. Um, so those districts wouldn't be impacted by full state funding, and they're let me rephrase that. Those districts are not necessarily impacted in the system we have now. If we were to go to a full state funding, though, then the state would collect and distribute all the education funding. So that would completely change the way we collect taxes around the state in that sense. Ramifications of full state funding, some problems with it. Burden of providing good school program is completely on the state. The biggest concern with full state funding is that it takes away from the local school to make changes based upon local students. And and certainly in a rather conservative state such as Oklahoma, we want to see as much local um, responsibility. So we hear the legislature say all the time. So this would not work for a state such as Oklahoma in our current political climate. It would take away. So the burden then would be on the state to provide a good school program. Well, the definition of good might be different depending on where you live in the state. Okay, and so that's going to raise some issues with this. Some districts are leveled up and some leveled down. Your text explains this in more detail, but basically this would obviously benefit the poor districts. If the state provided all the funding, it's going to help equalize them and level them up. But your wealthier districts, those that go off the formula, would not benefit from this system because they're already generating more on their own. So taking that away and putting it in the coffers for the state to distribute would level them down. Okay, and little local fiscal control may provide a voice for higher funding from the wealthy areas. And in that sense, what we're talking about here is that your wealthier districts are going to be able to weigh in a little bit. And it goes back to that first bullet of providing a good school program. We should probably put that in quotes. Because, again, good school program in one part of the state may be different than in another. And so it would be your wealthy districts that may have a voice in trying to dictate what that good school program would look like. And so that could be an issue in the long run. District Power Equalization, or DPE, how this works is equal funding by the state and local. Meaning the idea of Mills supported WPUs, or weights per unit, weights per student, is going to be equal. So some problems with this, though, are, um, if we say that the state is going to provide 10 meals per weighted student and the district will provide 10 meals per weighted student, um, then one of the problems here is the local district determines local effort and spending. State maintains financial responsibility for the entire program. There's some inequity in here because this may benefit again those poor districts who are able to provide the 10 meals. But if another district comes in and is a wealthy district and is able to provide an additional 5 meals or an additional 10 meals, when that comes in, then the idea of equity starts to go out the window a little bit. Okay. Each local district meal levy should produce the same number of dollars of total school revenue per meal. Power provided to poor districts to obtain revenue per student as more wealthy districts make same local tax effort. So there are more equity issues with the district power equalization formula than with the foundation formula. And so we don't see nearly as many places with this idea. In fact, I think that if you look in your text, and it may have been on that previous slide, I think there are only about 3 states that actually use that district power equalization formula. So some general rules then about state education funding. There is no perfect system for distributing state funds. The system we have here has been pretty constant for a number of decades, and there are still some issues with it. Okay, and you're going to see some of those issues when you start looking at dollars per student, and that dollars per student is going to have a range, and so there are some issues. It's not completely safe proof. No plan is accepted as best. Future plans will emphasize greater state involvement and less local responsibility. And that may be, again, a political, obviously a lot of this is tied to political environment, and that one seems to be a little bit more politically motivated. State tax sources will increase to meet surging education costs. So again, education is an industry that impacts every community in the country. And as a result, we're not going to see the cost of education ever decreasing. We're adding more and more students every year. The requirements, accountability are growing every year. What schools are expected to do are growing. And in general, salaries and things like that are growing as well, and benefits. So the cost of educating is not going to go down. So one thing then to keep in mind is that to continue to meet these costs, states will have to increase tax sources. Now, that's one of the problems in Oklahoma, because we have not had any tax increases. And even worse, we've had budget failure after budget failure, and we are still mired in the deep recession. So we obviously have to talk about taxes and the state providing taxes. And we're going to get into this even in the formula when we do some simulations in the formula. Okay, so enough about that here. A couple more things about state finance policy. The state guarantee will be based on rational decisions of how much is needed to meet state standards, law, and curriculum, and a two-tier system will be given more attention. We may get into that second to the last bullet, the penultimate bullet there, of the state guarantee will be based on rational decisions of how much is needed to meet state standards, law, and curriculum. That's an issue not only in Oklahoma, but in other states, I promise you. And we will talk about that. The idea here of making rational decisions. And there are states where these things work, okay? So one of the things that we do see in formulas around the country are the equalization of services and how these are starting to appear and be used. State equalization of services rather than dollars. And the idea, the rationale here is equal dollars don't provide equal units of service in unlike districts. And we've talked about this. That's our whole definition of equity, is that we can't treat unequals equally. And so equalization of services would mean providing the support to have equal services, not just providing dollars in lieu of those services. It would be the state providing those services. Okay. Some states are using cost of doing business factor. We don't use that in Oklahoma. With other adjustments for size and isolation to provide comparable funding for school districts within a state. We obviously do use isolation and density factors in the state. And while most districts do not use isolation or do not gain anything from isolation and density factors, and in the big picture, the isolation and density factors that we see, most do not use them. Most that do use them, they're minimal. There are a few small districts in the state, especially when you get out in western Oklahoma, where the schools are so isolated that they're compensated tremendously for that. And again, the whole idea behind this goes to an equity piece. We understand that it takes more to educate those students, and what your book really doesn't use is the term social capital. We're trying to introduce social capital to those students who are living out in the West, who may not have a neighbor for 5 miles, may not go to any cultural event or something. And so the idea of providing funds in an isolation factor in this sense would be the schools can provide opportunities for those students to gain the social capital that they may not necessarily gain on their own if left to their own devices. Okay, I'll give you a prime example. I grew up out in western Oklahoma, so I can talk about western Oklahoma. I never ate at a Chinese restaurant until I went to college. And I went to college. I grew up out in western Oklahoma on a farm. I never lived in the city or a town. I mean, I never lived in town until I went to college. The closest town to my house was 7 miles away. And so we didn't just go down to the store to get a pop or something. That just didn't happen because it was 7 miles away. So the first time that I moved away from that was when I went to college, and I went to college in Oklahoma City and moved right in the middle of Oklahoma City. And so there were a lot of adjustments that I made. Okay, the idea of the isolation money would be to provide districts with enough money that they could provide those kinds of opportunities for their students. That's the idea there. Some states are adding adjustments for high-cost students, such as students with disabilities. And most states have those types of weighting factors. So let's talk about weighting factors. We know that equal dollars per student do not produce equal products or results. And that's an issue that you as an administrator, future administrator, I would encourage you. We are not producing widgets. We don't have the same input, and we're not going to have the same output. Whatever our input is, we have goals, minimum goals we want our output to be at, but the output is not going to be the same. Okay? And so just to give equal dollars for students, more along the lines of a flat grant, does not work. Because we know that it takes more to educate different students. So we've already talked about isolation and density factors and the reasons why it takes more to educate those students. Other weighting factors, though, include we're looking at diverse characteristics of our students, district size and attendance, transportation costs. Really what we're going to look at is this diverse characteristics of our students. Okay, so weighting factors, best measures of additional resources and services. So remember what I had said earlier. When we're talking for Oklahoma, when we're talking about students and the cost of educating, everything we do, we have to somehow convert to students. Schools are paid based on students. And so if we want to add additional support for an isolation factor, we have to convert that to students. If we want to add a program, okay, for example, special ed program, if we want to implement special ed program, we know it's going to cost the district more because we have to hire special ed teachers, and they typically get in Oklahoma 5% um, pay over the minimum, hazard pay of 5%. Their classrooms are much smaller. So instead of having that typical teacher to student ratio of 1 to 25, you might have 1 to 5 1 hour, and 1 to 6, and 1 to 10, and then 1 to 1 for the last hour of the day. So we have to have special education programs. It's federal law. Uh, we know that they cost more, and so therefore we convert that into students. And the way that we do that is by looking at categorical weights. Okay, so students with a program that is 50% higher than average, where the state guarantee is weighted 50% and counts as 1.5 students for funding purposes. What that technical definition is saying is that we know that it costs more to educate a, a student with autism. And so that student is going to count now not just as one student, but as, I think it's 2.8 or something. It's a pretty big number. A learning disability, we know those students can generally operate in the mainstream classroom. Even so, they're going to need some extra support. And so it's going to cost a little extra to educate them. And so therefore that student, instead of counting as 1, is going to count as 1.34. The same with other programs, as we'll see on this next slide here. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the bottom here. We talked about special ed weighting a little bit. Low income weighting, compensatory education. What we're talking about here is, again, it's that lack of social capital, and we know that these students are typically, on average, going to start behind the starting line because they do lack that social capital. And so we want to help those students as much as we can get caught up. And so in schools that have students, and in Oklahoma, it's based on free and reduced lunches. And we just look at that number, and those students, instead of counting as 1, they count as 1.25. So you as a principal, that's why your superintendent is going to be on you to get those free and reduced forms in. But before the October 1st count, of course, that's when we take our official count in Oklahoma is October 1. So before that October 1st count, we have to get all those free and reduced forms in, because each one, as we'll see, is about $800 extra to the school, okay, or to the district. And you'll understand what I'm saying here in another week or so. English language learners are the same thing. We know that they cost extra to educate, and so therefore you have a bilingual education line for ELL students. And in Oklahoma, they're weighted as 0.25. So every form you get in, again, you as principal have to get those home surveys returned to you by October 1st, and you input that. Every student who returns their form and qualifies as an ELL student is counted as 1.25. So again, it's a little bit extra in that sense. So the sparsity and density factors we already talked about. a little bit. Uh, we don't use the density factor in Oklahoma, mainly because we only have two urban areas, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and it just hasn't been introduced into the state. Again, we have over 500 districts. Now, those two districts take in an exceedingly large amount of our students in the state. Based on just those two districts, they have about 80,000 students between the two of them. There are about 600,000 students in the state, so almost uh, a sixth of the students in the state are in only two districts. So, but nonetheless, we don't use density factors in Oklahoma. We use sparsity factors. We use the isolation factor, and we use grade level weighting. This says grade level weighting in favor of secondary schools. We just use grade level weighting, period. So we don't just weight our secondary schools more. And the reason for this is because it costs more to run a secondary school. Uh, when you look at the weights that you were doing, if you notice, the middle school years are weighted as 1 in Oklahoma. The high school years, I think, are 1.12 or 1.2. So every student in grade 7 is counted as 1 for that grade weight. But every student in grade 9 is counted as 1.2 for that grade weight. Okay? And the reason we do that is because we realize it costs more to run a high school. You have to have teachers who are specialized. You have to have that certified physics teacher or certified trigonometry teacher, and you typically aren't going to have the same number of students, so they're going to have a low number of students in their classes. But yeah, you're going to pay them probably the same or maybe even more. They may have a master's degree, you're going to pay them a little bit more than a teacher who's teaching a full class every day in middle school. So that's why we weight secondary classes a little bit more. In elementary school, we weight them a little bit more, primarily because their class sizes are limited. In Oklahoma, I think it's 1 to 23 is the ratio of teacher to students. Above 23, you can go above 23 a little bit if you have an aide in the room, but you start getting penalized by the state if you break that. So again, in middle school, you can have 30 students in your grade and every hour, and you're fine. But in elementary school, you have to have 1 per 23. So therefore, we know that we have to have more elementary teachers, and it's going to cost the school district money. So if you have a large enrollment in your elementary, you're going to generate more money there. If you can keep that enrollment up as those students go on through high school, you're going to keep getting additional monies from your high school as well. So the weights then. So one question would be, well, what about a student who is in first grade and is a special ed student and lives out in the sticks? Well, that student gets counted for all those. Okay, so they get the first grade weight. So you'll hear me talk about grade weights. Those are completely independent and on their own, grade weights. Then you'll hear me talk about student weights. Okay, student weights is going to come in when we talk about special education, ELL, and free and reduced lunch, or farm kids, as you probably heard me call them, free and reduced meals, farm kids. So each of those is independent. So one student can be in each category, and they carry over. And then the sparsity and isolation are their own factors as well. And at that point, the students really don't come into those factors. Again, those are district level, as you can see. The student level, we're really talking about grade weights and pupil weights, are the way we define them in Oklahoma. So one more thing here about special education. You can see that different states have different ways of providing additional funds for special education. The main way that we do it in Oklahoma is directly through our weighting of special ed programs. We do give some cost reimbursement. You do have students who take summer school when, in order not to have that summer brain drain. It's not uncommon to have summer school for just special ed students. And when you look at the weighted ADM page in the formula, you will see that in Oklahoma we compensate schools who have students participate in summer programs, and we just give them, again, those students are counted as extra for every child who participates in a summer program. I think it may be 1.5 or something like that. But anyway, you get the idea. It's just a different way of weighting, but we do it for summer programs. So again, here's just a little bit of a brief idea of how different states do funding, and you can see for the most part we do, as I just said, per pupil weighting is how we do our special ed funding. And then the last thing we want to look at is ELL. And again, this is a category that in Oklahoma we give, again, a pupil weight for ELL students. It's a 0.25 weight, which equates to about $800 per identified student. So just a couple of statistics here. You can see 3 or 4 states provide funding for each area of student need. Only 4 states do not provide either. And when we're talking about the areas of need, we're including low-income students. So we provide additional monies for low-income and ELL students. Nevada, Montana, South Dakota, and West Virginia don't provide any for either of those. And then the other states provide either one or the other. And here's just a breakdown of how that works out for you, okay? And that is it. So this will work with you a little bit. Where this is going to come in is as you're figuring those weighted ADMs. Again, the main thing I want you to get out of this goes back to the equity piece. Why do we even do this? And we're doing this as a result of equity. We're trying to make get our unequals as equal as possible. Okay, and to do that, we have to provide additional resources for those. We have to treat our unequals unequally, and that's what we're doing, is we're providing additional resources. So in the picture of a school, that means a school district who has a larger number of special ed students, ELL students, Title I or farm kid students. That district is going to receive more money from the state than would a district that we think of as being the quote-unquote rich district. Okay?